Today we're going to talk about why your game needs to be ugly, and there's so many benefits for doing this. For example, you can speedrun your game development, you'll have less distractions, and you'll be able to make even more content than you believe. But this is a very critical thing because from personal experience, I firmly believe that art paralyzes your game production. I'm saying this because sometimes I would polish menus, I would do character animations, I would put a lot of effort in writing backgrounds, all for nothing because it ended up getting into cut content, or I just simply realized that my game didn't really need this feature at the beginning, right? The other thing is, I ended up making my own game in 90 days simply because I left all of the polishing at the very end. And this is a very effective tactic to make your game work. In fact, I would argue that you would have the ability to stress test your mechanics, and then, by putting placeholders around your game, you can just test out the functionality of it first. And there's a lot of other intrinsic benefits of doing so that I'll talk about here in a moment. But all I'm trying to say is that you want to make sure that you have a working prototype that actually validates and proves that your game works, and you can skip a bunch of development issues when you say, hey, you know what, game works, let's go ahead and polish it once we actually have something that functions. Now, let's talk about what happens when you actually decide to prioritize polishing your game very first, very early on, and that becomes a key critical issue because there are a lot of problems that show up when this happens. We're talking about how iteration is basically repeated work that you're doing that you don't need to do. Perfection is, basically the enemy of progress. Sometimes you add features that you simply don't need. You disrespect your deadline. You become a little bit lazy when you overestimate the fact that, hey, polishing is probably easy, right? But you end up overestimating that. There's just so many things, right? And I want to talk about the key core issues. For example, reiteration is something that exists. And I basically say, hey, if you don't have your final idea in mind, you're cooked because you're basically putting a lot of effort and time into things that simply won't make it at launch, right? Maybe the first iteration of your character just never sees the surface of the market. Therefore, you didn't need to do it in the first place. And so there are ways to delegate and even say, hey, how do I go from the first phase all the way to the final phase, right? And again, I'll mention that in just a second here, but realize that the less finality your ideas have, the more likely you're going to spend more time and effort working on things that, again, just won't make it at the end of the actual published product. The other thing is kind of like what I was just talking about earlier. You might see art as something that's a little bit easy, and you might say, "Oh yeah, I can fix this up in like 5 minutes," right? And then you end up engaging in that task, and you realize that you're spending way too much time doing so because you didn't, you kind of like overestimated the fact that, hey, it's kind of easy to do. And actually, this is another problem that we have where sometimes we go by emotions and kind of like the vibe of like, oh, it looks good, or it needs more polishing, this and that. But what happens is if you don't have what's called a LAS, also known as the lowest acceptable standard of how you're addressing your art and your tasks in general, then you don't have a definition of what the final aspect looks like. In other words, if you said, hey, I need to make a character, okay, what does your character need, right? They probably need a definitive shape, they need to be readable, they need to have a specific color pattern, and then you're set. And if you are just going by vibes and saying, oh, it needs more time to cook, then again, you will never know what the end looks like until you apply LAS. Again, lowest acceptable standard. Finally, another huge issue is, sometimes we engage in making content or features that simply, again, don't end up in the actual final product of the game. And this is what we call an open road, or rather an open development cycle, which means you're just adding things, iterating, just checking things out to see like, hey, does this work or does it not work? And there is a way where you can actually just break this down quickly so that you can just focus on making the game and launching it as quick as possible, right? And so yeah, but controversial, right? But yes, you can make a game without iterating or even polishing early. In fact, there's a whole method behind this that I like to talk about. So let's go ahead and talk about the differences between a GDD and a roadmap. You see, a GDD is extremely useful because it basically establishes the rules of what your game is going to look like, what it feels like, what are the kind of like standards that your game needs in order to work. But the flaw is that it allows for a bunch of iteration because if your standard is very open ended, if there's barely like any definitive like, oh, let's make a monster, right? The game's gonna have 5 monsters, it's gonna have these bosses, this not okay. But if you don't put a strict list of like, well, monster number one is going to have 20 HP, it does these damages, it's going to do this, it's this elemental typing. If you can't make it as clear or objective as possible, you're basically just going to develop until you have what you feel like is correct, right? And so on the opposite end of a GDD is the roadmap, which is basically going to be a sequential task of what you need to do in order to build your game. the argument or the reason why this is like controversial is because it is restrictive, it cuts your creativity, and it's a very mechanical approach. In other words, you have to understand what your final game's design is going to look like and then build your game based off of that. And so that might take a little skill, that might take a little bit of time and experimentation to see, okay, how does my final game look like? How do I reverse engineer that? And how do I make the tasks possible so that I can go ahead and, apply the the necessary sequences that I have to do to make my game come out, right? And so the cool thing is you can actually combine both of these so that you have a standard of what your game is going to look like, what it feels like, based off of the direction that you as a developer wants to tackle, and then you can just make those tasks, broken down into things that you can digest, right? And by the way, I made this other video kind of explaining that, but the long story short is, okay, we can make a roadmap, we can cut iteration time, we can apply the lowest acceptable standard in our prototype. What does this have to do with ugliness, right? So like there are things we can do to, stop wasting a lot of time when making our games, right? But why are we talking about ugliness, messiness, unorganized? Like why are we talking about that in particular? And so I'm going to tell you that while planning and having all of these tasks is critical and super important, there is one trick that you need to apply in order to just speed run your development even faster than usual. And it's that if players can understand the absolute garbage fire of a mess that you're making, if they understand it, if they have fun with it, if they're playing it, if they actually enjoy it, you're cooking. You're basically making a game that is fun. And so what I'd like to say is, hey, imagine that your game is like hyper ugly and everything and it's enjoyable. Imagine what it would look like if you were to polish it, right? Now, I need to exaggerate here that this is why your prototype needs to be ugly. And the keyword here is going to be prototype. Okay. It needs to be ugly for a bunch of reasons, and we're gonna go into that. But more, the number one thing is like if it's understandable ugly, then you have a good game design. But it has to be the prototype in particular because at the end of the day, games are meant to be appealing. They're supposed to be beautiful. They're supposed to be visually appealing and such. Obviously, there's some exceptions, such as Vampire Survivors, no beef. But there are things you need to do to say, you know what, I need to make this game as quickly as possible. I need to validate it. I need to make sure that it works, that it's fun, and then I'll spend time polishing because polishing is going to take a very long time. In other words, all we're doing is talking about making a strong foundation for your game. You basically want to put the puzzle pieces together, make sure that you have every possible corner covered, and then when you realize, okay, now I can start decorating my game left and right, guess what? Now you have a good, fun game that is also appealing and fun, and beautiful for others to look at. That being said, there are a bunch of advantages to just making your game ugly, right? As we're talking about. Again, we're going to talk about the prototype in particular. Make your prototype as ugly as possible because you want to make sure that your beta and the polishing phase has its own respect on how you want to make it better, right? So number one, looks don't matter, at least not yet, because the priority of what the prototype prioritizes is functionality. Like, does your game work? Is it mechanical enough? Does it do the inputs and outputs that you're asking for? Does it give you the feeling that you're looking for? Can you emulate the experience that players are supposed to feel when they play the game? These are the important questions you have to ask first, right? The other thing is that if you understand that you can respect your deadline, you can respect your plans, you can respect the phases of how you do development, one, you avoid distractions, and two, you become faster because now you're so keenly focused on finishing task number one, then task number two. Like you're going to do it in a sequential order to the point where you recognize, if I actually follow step 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 in the order that I said I was going to do, without distractions, without saying, oh, let me polish this, without, oh, well, this needs a little bit more tweaking, just doing it as mechanical as possible, you will be making incredible progress. The next thing is polishing is actually 50% of game development. And I'm telling you this because when I was making Dodge King in 90 days, 30 plus days was used just like fixing the art, making sure that the sounds were okay. Like the visual format of the game was like so heavy to like fix and everything, right? And so the only way you can make 50% drop to like 25% or like really lower down the amount of polish you have to do is if you just absolutely finish your entire game first and then simply replace the assets that you had in mind. And so this is something that's going to help you a lot because you basically say, wow, I can speed run my game development simply by making the entire game mechanically and then focus on the art later. But I really want to drive the point home when I say that polishing is 50% of the development cycle because it is genuinely more work than you will ever think, right? And so here's also what I call the power of placeholders, right? Imagine you are making your game and you're like, this game is kind of ugly. Like it's kind of messy. I personally do not like seeing my game like this at this state, right? And the trick about this is that as humans, we like to see visually pleasing objects and items and environments, right? And so what happens is that by you actively leaving something messy in the background, you're employing what's called a open door effect, which is basically in the back of your mind, you're thinking, huh, I really need to fix that. I really need to do something about it. Like your instinct is itching to deal with the issue at hand. But if you're able to just like dismiss it in the background, one, it's going to be living rent free in the back of your mind. But two, in a weird way, you have this intrinsic reasoning to say, you know what? Let me finish the game, the prototype. Let me do all the tasks that I have to do. And my reward will be able to go back into the placeholder, replace it with something visually pleasing, more appealing. And now I can satisfy that open door effect by now closing the door, getting the closure that I want, and moving on with my life and everything, right? And so the other thing about this is, while you can use placeholders, you can also leverage geometric meshes as much as possible. Meaning, maybe you want to use a bullet, and instead of putting a placeholder of a bullet, you just put like a little square or a sphere. Maybe you are representing a character with an actual cube. Maybe there's a collectible that you can collect with a cone. Again, you can kind of like delegate or decode what geometrical shapes can look like when you just delegate that, right? So it's like, hey, this shape represents that. This other shape represents this. This other shape represents this other item. And you can leverage that to just make games faster and more scalable, right? The other thing is, again, and this is the point that I kept trying to hammer here. If your game is fun, ugly, imagine how it would be polished, right? And the important part about this is that you really want to make sure that you have play testers as well, because you can subjectively tell your own yourself like, oh yeah, this game is ugly, whatever, I'll make it look better. But how do you actually know that, right? You need play testers to actually validate, and you need to be comfortable letting your play testers play something that is, again, not necessarily visually pleasing. It could be ugly, it could be messy, it could be dirty, it could be something that players are like, I probably wouldn't spend money on this. And that's okay, because if they're able to play it, enjoy it, and actually find a lot of value with it, they're only going to get more excited when you're able to polish it later. And so, speaking of playtesters, when you only focus on the mechanical aspect of your game and you just disregard the visuals, you will be able to receive faster feedback on what works, how it feels like to control the character, the controllers, the level design, how certain weapons feel. And so the craziest part about this is that if your players can understand the experience that they're going through and have fun with it, not only are you validating your game's viability and its validity, but you're flexing your game design skills. Because again, as like a developer, if you're able to make something fun at the end of the day, that's a flex. That's something that you want to share to the market, right? Now it just comes down to, okay, well, now it's fun, so now I can put the visual part that makes it appealing and pleasing, right? The other thing is, when you build things scalable, in other words, like you're using prefabs, you basically have this one master game object that has the ability to just you can tweak a couple of variables and then it can become its own character and such. You basically have a machine that can produce a lot of content. So, for example, in Dodge King, you basically have the main character. The main playable object has a bunch of mechanics that every single character is going to have, which is jumping, dodging, shielding, attacking, etc. But there are certain variable tweaks that you can add to give your main character different abilities, right? So I realized, okay, wait a minute, the main character, Dodge King, right, All Night, he doesn't have any abilities, he doesn't have anything special, so he just represents the master object. But now we have another character, Mycenae, right? Mycenae does double the damage. Okay, cool. So the only difference between All Night and Mycenae is going to be the double damage aspect. Well, guess what? Now I have two pieces of content, two playable characters. Now all I have to do is just, put the art and we're done. Okay, cool. I can rinse and repeat this ideology with every other aspect or every other character that I want, and you basically multiply the amount of characters that you're able to have in your game. And now, again, you have more content than you expected, because at first you just had one character, and now because you have these little variables that you can tweak, you can have multiple. The only thing that you have to do is add the actual visuals, which you will deal with at the very end. And so, lastly, remember that open door effect we were talking about? If you're just able to let something burn in the background, right? Like there's a fire in the background and you're aware of it, but you're just going to let it do what it has to do. You're basically giving yourself the ability to prolong the amount of time for things to have its course And this is what allows you to build tolerance. And this is very important because as game developers, you're going to be dealing with a lot of technical challenges that require you to sit down with a problem for a prolonged amount of time. And so the more tolerant you are with problems, the more likely you are to engage into finding a solution. In other words, hey, that might bother you now, but now's not the time to focus on that. You should lock in on your current task. Once you're done with all of that, guess what? You can now, close the door and, let Incineroar do a parting shot, right? Anyway, last thing, and really important, as you're writing your prototype, you could also just delegate, meaning you can hire an artist, you can get assets, you can do a bunch of things to just, completely deal with the polishing independently, right? So you focus on mechanical stuff and then, hey, artist friend, can you like write these characters? Can you make these sprites? Can you do the background art? Can you make me assets? Can you make models? Can you do the animations and everything? And once you do all of that, well, now you just have two independent paths that can mix together and finish your game. Now, here's one important crucial part. Let's say that you have the argument, but wait, my game focuses on art. Like please, my art has to come first. Okay. There's one major approach that I will advertise for you to do, and that is to only focus on the key or the main art of your game. Meaning, if you have an art piece that, let's say a character, for example, right, where the entire premise revolves around the character, then you probably want to polish your character to a T so that, it represents exactly what the game is going to feel like and look like and everything. And then everything else can be a placeholder and be empty. And I think the best example for this is this game called Cannonhead. So Cannonhead by Rod 3D Art is actually a character, right? I mean, he basically has a cannon for his head. Pretty straightforward, but if you notice, the entire game revolves around the character, meaning like having a certain type of cannon on his head, his movement system, how it's a third person shooter. Like there's a bunch of things you have to be aware about. And so you'll quickly notice that, Rod here, he had to double down on the actual character, polish it, make sure that it was like, okay, this is the game. The character is the game at the end of the day. So yeah, he's gonna have to polish everything perfectly. But then if you notice, everything else not related to the character is just placeholders. So this is where he practices his level designs, his items, objects, everything else, and they're all placeholders that can be replaced. So this is really great design because now he has the main premise that is the main reason why you're buying the game, why you're carrying the game as a whole. And so because he's able to make the entire game just with that one key art being the main character, and then everything else is like empty placeholders, that means when he's done with the game, all he has to do is replace the placeholders, replace the assets with actual characters, UI, things that look beautifully visual and everything. And in fact, that's what he's doing right now. As you can see, this is a screenshot of later in development where after the prototype was done, after all of the mechanics were working and such, well, now he's working on enemies. Now he's working on, everything else that works. Let me remind you one more time. That's totally fine, but you can only focus on the mechanical stuff in the prototype, and then you deal with the polishing once the prototype is done completely. So don't be afraid to be messy. Don't be afraid to leave things empty and such. Only make sure that your game, works, right? And so the last little side note that I want to get to real quick regarding character design is that character design plays a bigger role than you think because it's basically going to be a way of how your players are introduced to your game. If there's a really cool character doing really cool things, then guess what? They're probably going to be a little bit intrigued, curious, interested, and they're probably going to look into it more and say, wow, this game looks cool. I wonder what this character is actually doing. Can I play like this? Can I do that? Where can I travel? Who can I fight? And so this is very applicable and very relevant if you are making a game that is character centric, right? If it's something more generic, if it's like a simulator and such, then okay, maybe not the most necessary topic for you to know. But at the same time, again, if you have a character centric game, it is very important to polish just the main character, maybe a boss, something that just directly represents what you're going to be playing with the entire time, right? Now, I want to end this little talk with a couple of examples of how games were made with, just literally being nothing but prototypes, having everything ready, and then just asset flipping at the end so that it kind of has a large piece of leverage, right? And so just to be real quick, using my own game again as an example, Dodge King, I had a lot of ugly systems. And when I was done writing those ugly systems, I said, okay, now we're going to use the polishing phase to make better art. And that's exactly what we have here. A little fun fact, Horizon Zero Dawn, the entire game was made with placeholders, right? The only things that they cared about for hyper polishing was the main character, bosses, and extremely relevant, key mechanics, right? Or, key monsters in this case, right? And so once they had literally the entire game done in placeholders and everything, then that's when they hired the artist and that's when they did all of the work to actually polish everything else. And then the game was eventually released, right? Cannonhead, again, I just talked about, you basically want to have a prototype, make your entire game out of it, and then just replace the assets later. And even in my little teaser here with my new game, I'm literally just using sprites and meshes, and that's it. No animations, no extra effects. I only want to make sure that it actually works so that when it feels good, it works, it does what it has to do, we're set. Then I can go ahead and add all the art that I need to do, and then we should be A-okay. Now, just to be clear, because typically I skip a lot of details when I do these presentations, let's do a quick recap, right? So number one, you want to make sure that you're making your entire game mechanically. You want to put all your features, you want to make sure that you are planning it correctly, that you deal with your tasks at hand, but more importantly, just validate the fact that your game actually makes sense. And so what's important here is you don't focus on the looks, you don't focus on the polish, you just get the game working. That's the most important thing. Once you have your game working, if possible, and this is kind of like genre dependent because maybe your game needs way more polishing during the development simply because again you're extremely artistic, or there are very heavy systems that you have to come back to that you just have to keep tweaking based on game balance and such. But long story short, try to make your entire game in the ugly format, in the empty, messy format. Just make the game. Forget about the art, forget about everything, just make the game. And then once you're done with the game completely, like, oh, you could launch the game basically, right? Okay, now what you want to do is, replace your assets and just go ahead and make it more artistic and everything. Work with artists, use assets, use all the cool little effects that the game engines offer for you to actually like make it more visually pleasing. And that's pretty much all you have to do to make a game faster when it comes to just, leaving the polishing phase all the way at the end. So all I'm saying is make a prototype, make your game out of the prototype, and then fix the art later. That's my advice. That's my recommendation. That's what I did, and that's how I made my game in 90 days. So if you guys enjoyed that video, then yeah, that's cool.